A facility outside Chicago that descended into open war.
They sent him in to make peace, and he left in a body bag.
A Bosnian hideout saved by an act of sabotage.
For about a month, he's essentially a double agent, working both sides.
A Taiwanese port city fortified to resist a fearsome enemy.
Keelung became their coffin.
And an ancient settlement in Portugal crushed under a wave of change.
A kind of modern-day Atlantis is emerging from the mud.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In Joliet, Illinois, a rotting complex dominates the horizon.
We're on the industrial edge of the city. You can see a railroad following the river.
In the middle of it all is what looks like a Gothic castle.
You've got these razor wire fences, these high watchtowers. Clearly, it's a prison.
This is almost like a city within a city.
After years of neglect, it's corroded to its core.
You've got peeling paint hanging like stalactites, rusted cell doors stretching on as far as the eye can see.
Filled with the echoes of violence, horror, and desperation, this facility would come to play a key role in an iconic pop culture moment.
It's probably best known around the world as the temporary residence of one Joliet Jake.
Zach Tyler is a local historian who has been exploring this moldering ruin since 2017.
Over the years, the Joliet prison would develop a reputation as one of the toughest prisons in America, a literal hell on earth. No doubt the inmates would have felt fear, apprehension, despair.
So Illinois State Penitentiary Joliet began its life on May 22nd, 1858.
From the outset, it was built on the very backs of those it confined.
We are standing in the North Sag building. This is the very first building built on the prison grounds. It was built by the inmates themselves, who were brought in here from Alton, Illinois.
They literally began to construct the prison around themselves, including quarrying the limestone that goes into its walls.
At first, there was a period of optimism.
The warden had the prison's unofficial motto, "It's never too late to mend," engraved in the floor in the early years of prison operation in order to remind the inmates it was never too late to change their behavior.
When the prison opened, it was very well received. The Chicago Tribune said it should be the pride of her citizens.
Originally designed for 900 inmates, it wasn't long before that limit was breached.
This is the only remaining cell from 1858. They were only intended for one man at a time, but by the 1870s, they were housing as many as 2 to 3 inmates in them.
Just 14 years after they've opened their doors, they're already up to 1,200 inmates. It's making it the biggest prison in the entire country.
The prison conditions worsened dramatically in that time. Without indoor plumbing, unfortunately, sanitation went by the wayside and inmates were frequently catching preventable diseases here.
Over the course of the 19th century, the prison became locked in a cycle, expanding to house a growing population and controlling the violence driven by this overcrowding.
Fights, stabbings, and even hangings were commonplace.
By the early 1940s, Joliet and its sister prison, Stateville, were housing 4,000 inmates. And the cramped, unsanitary conditions would soon draw the attention of the US government.
This hospital opened in 1895. This building saw more death than any other building on the prison grounds. Not only did they treat inmates here, they also began testing on them.
Hepatitis is a common disease that occurs when people are crowded too close together without good sanitation. And for the military, that's often the conditions that soldiers face when they're deployed. The U.S. Army had a terrible outbreak of hepatitis during World War II, and that got them interested in doing more to research the causes and prevention of the disease.
After the war, the U.S. Army commissioned pharmaceutical researchers to study the disease with the hope of finding a vaccine.
If you want to study a disease, you need test subjects, and in some cases, you actually need to infect people with the illness in order to learn more about it.
The researchers soon turned to Joliet.
It is in places like this where the government would have been doing their hepatitis experiments on the inmates. You would have had multiple beds, housing several inmates at a time.
So what prisoners were actually agreeing to was to drink feces-laden chocolate milkshakes and be exposed to the feces of other inmates. That way, researchers could mass produce and isolate the virus that was causing hepatitis.
The goal was to get more samples of the virus in order to be able to study it in the laboratory. Between 1959 and 1969, they recruited at least 300 prisoners.
Testing at Joliet continued as late as the 1970s, never producing a working vaccine. Hundreds of inmates had been exposed to the risk of long-term complications from the experiments.
We're sort of horrified by this now, but at the time, this kind of experimentation was pretty common, and people just sort of accepted it as the cost of doing business.
Although Joliet's government-sponsored experimentation had come to an end, just a few years later, a new organization would wreak havoc here, as power struggles sparked on the streets of Chicago ignited inside the prison walls.
Gangs have always been a major problem in the old Joliet prison. They outnumbered the guards by a significant margin. The Almighty Black Keystone Nation in particular had a lot of clout and accounted for a couple hundred of the inmates housed in the West Cell House.
Originally known as the Blackstone Rangers, the group rose to prominence in the 1960s in Chicago's South Side area.
They were a really interesting, you could even say innovative organization. On the one hand, they were involved in all kinds of criminal activities, running drugs and other things. On the other hand, they also were involved in some positive work on behalf of the community. They even received some grants from the federal government and from some charitable institutions to run certain programs to help the poor Black community in Chicago.
But as more of their members were sent to Joliet, the authorities began to lose control.
The gangs were able to coerce other inmates and even occasionally guards, whether through threats or bribery.
Warden Fred L. Finkbeiner realized he had to break their grip on the West Cell Block. On the 22nd of April 1975, he took action.
He ordered the transfer of 3 high-ranking gang members to curtail some of the influence they held over the prison.
But the warden made a crucial mistake. He announced in the morning that these 3 prisoners were going to be taken away later that day. That gave the prisoners time to spread the news and to plan a way to resist.
The group sprang into action.
They streamed back into the galleries, taking control of the upper levels and holding 8 members of staff hostage.
They start issuing demands. Their main demand is that the removal of their leaders be stopped.
The gang members would have torn out the mattresses and used those to fortify the cells and the upper galleries to prevent corrections officers from getting in and breaking up the riot. If the guards had stormed into the West Cell House, the Almighty Black Keystone Nation undoubtedly would have killed the hostages.
The warden turned to an unlikely ally to try and bring the riot to a peaceful conclusion.
There was one prisoner named Herbert Catlett. He was a former gang member who'd reformed. He went in to try to negotiate with the gang.
Herbert Catlett would never leave the cell block alive.
We're standing outside of cell 234. This is the cell where Herbert Catlett was stabbed to death by members of his own gang who viewed him as a traitor.
With Catlett dead and prison staff being held by the inmates, the warden had the lives of the hostages in his hands.
In the end, the warden had to give in to their demands. He broadcast a message saying the 3 inmates would not be transferred.
The riot ended with all the hostages released alive. And it appears that authorities did not want the events inside the West Cell house to become public knowledge.
The state of Illinois felt it would give the state a bad image, and they ultimately swept it under the rug.
Just 4 years later, the warden would be much less publicity shy.
We're standing outside of the East Sally Port. Just ahead of us is Collins Street, or 171st, part of the old Route 66. This is where they filmed the opening scene of the Blues Brothers back in 1979.
The John Belushi character's nickname is Joliet Jake, because supposedly he's been a longtime resident of the Joliet prison. There's the iconic scene where Jake leaves the Joliet prison to be picked up by his partner, Elwood Blues.
They only had one chance to get the take, though, because the warden, rightfully so, was worried about opening and closing the gates over and over again in a working prison.
But even the bright lights of Hollywood couldn't keep the aging facility open much longer. By 2002, the last inmates had been transferred and the prison was left to decay.
It's said that the authorities just took the guns and the radios, and pretty much everything else was left behind.
Today, the old Joliet prison is open for tours. In 2022, one of its most iconic moments was brought back to life.
Today, the city of Joliet tries to keep the memory of the Blues Brothers alive with an annual Blues Brothers convention, a 2-day affair.
So John Belushi's brother stepped in for him, and he and Dan Aykroyd performed as the Blues Brothers on the main stage.
It's a beautiful event, a blessed event. We had people from all over the country and all over the world who came out here just to attend.
In Bosnia and Herzegovina, a mountain complex sits hidden in the woods.
This is lush, rugged mountain country.
And as you walk along the riverbank, you see these, typical Bosnian villas or chalets.
But these buildings hide one of the nation's deepest buried secrets.
Then at the end of it is a big steel hatch, almost like you'd see in a submarine.
But instead of keeping out the massive pressure of the deep sea, you are keeping out something equally powerful, but even more horrific.
Up in the woods above the chalet is this kind of pyramid concrete building.
So you have the sense that this is somehow connected to the buildings down below.
Built to protect the unity of a nation, these structures faced complete destruction.
It survived because of 2 men and a daring act of sabotage.
Anita Kokoya has been leading people through the halls of this structure for years.
You see 3 simple houses, which are just camouflage houses, so no one who would watch from the other side of Neretva River would imagine there is a huge bunker behind it. Just as you enter one of those houses, the first thing you notice is a huge tunnel. And then you just walk across the tunnel and meet one massive green door, which would be the main entrance into the bunker.
comprised of 6,500 square meters of tunnels that stretch down far beneath the ground. This is no ordinary shelter.
It was designed in a U-shape, mainly because the bunker was built in the case of nuclear strike, which means U-shape would kind of amortize the strike, and the strike would be much softer.
Named the Atomic War Command, or ARC, this imposing bunker was built with one purpose in mind.
A place like this is one of the few places that makes absolutely clear how seriously thinking, powerful people took the prospect of global thermonuclear war and how it dominated decision-making at every level for decades.
And once inside this place, strolling around from room to room, it quickly becomes apparent who authorized this place, who built this place, and who it was for. Marshal Tito.
As the Cold War heated up, Yugoslavian President Josip Broz Tito needed a place to continue running his country in the case of nuclear fallout.
There's even essentially an apartment for Tito and his family with a bedroom, an office space. You could live down here.
And here we are in a luxurious part of the bunker, but as you can see, it's still pretty basic. This is a presidential area of the bunker, and here is Tito's private office. And straight from this room, you go to Tito's bedroom.
And the central control of Yugoslavia was going to be right here in this bunker.
But the greatest threat to this bunker came from within.
Something this big and elaborate is going to take a long time to build, 26 years, in fact. So by the time it's finally finished in 1979, Tito's essentially on his deathbed.
So the irony is Tito died 1 year after this bunker was completed. Often asked question is if Tito ever been here, but there's no official evidence.
While Tito may have come to inspect progress of the bunker, only a handful of officials knew of its existence, so no record was ever made.
In 1980, Tito is out of the picture, which means there is nothing left to hold Yugoslavia together.
By 1992, the individual republics were declaring their independence, and the 16 soldiers of the Yugoslav People's Army that garrisoned Tito's bunker saw their loyalty severely tested. Amid the growing conflict, command handed down orders regarding the fate of the complex.
And here we are in a recording room where two men, Grabovica and Andrić, were in a time when they got an order from General Kokanec from Belgrade, and the order came through this phone, and the order was destroy the bunker.
In March 1992, amid the breakup of Yugoslavia, you had the Yugoslav National Army, which was essentially the Serbian army, battling inside Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so this bunker will remain inside Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the retreating Serbian commander, not wanting to turn it over, was going to blow the whole thing up, just rig it with TNT at every entrance and every tunnel and just collapse it from within.
But little did the Serbian authorities know, the call had come through to a character straight from the pages of a spy novel.
One of these soldiers who worked in these top secret tunnels had been sneaking off for months, talking with the Bosnian government. He told them he wanted to join their cause, and so revealed what he'd been doing and where he'd been working all those years.
He then goes back and spends a couple of weeks with his comrades at the Ark, laying explosives and planning to blow it up.
And so for about a month, he's essentially a double agent working both sides.
Unaware of the traitor in their ranks, The Yugoslav soldiers in charge of the bunker prepared to carry out their orders.
So here are 2 diesel tanks, and there were explosive devices placed under those tanks in March in 1992. So basically, the whole bunker would be blown away.
And when the order comes to blow the place up, they are all 16 of them going to climb up the escape hatch. They're going to go out through the concrete pyramid, and they are going to be picked up by a helicopter and evacuated. When the helicopter is ready to dust off from that mountainside, and you count them up, there are not 16 soldiers on that helicopter. There are only 14. 2 soldiers are missing.
While the 14 soldiers departed, Grabovica and Andrich carried out their sabotage.
As the other soldiers were climbing the ladder, they fell behind and snuck back into the entire facility. Then they rush around, cutting the wires so the explosives wouldn't blast. Then they make their own escape, but don't follow the other men and escape into history instead.
Serif Grabovica's own claims about being a double agent have never been verified, so his motives for the sabotage may never be truly known.
Maybe because they were more loyal to the new state of Bosnia-Herzegovina than the old state of Yugoslavia or to Serbia, or maybe because they just thought it was wasteful to destroy such a thing that had been built at such great expense by Tito.
The 2 of men probably disobeyed the order from General Kukanets, mainly because they were citizens of Konjic, the town nearby, and the main motive was the loyalty to the town.
The Ark bunker narrowly avoided complete destruction. Not long after the Yugoslav army evacuated, the advancing Bosnians took control of the abandoned structure.
The bunker, now in the hands of the new Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, use it as a supply dump.
This space is uncommon in that it survived. All those old military spaces that had been a part of Yugoslavia, most of them were destroyed, but this wasn't one of them.
Tito's bunker was put to use as a supply depot and medical base for the remainder of the Bosnian War. Meanwhile, the breakup of Yugoslavia precipitated a period of intense violence between the newly independent nations.
Neighbor was turning against neighbor. Friends, sometimes even relatives, were turning against people from other national groups in ways that had been irrelevant for decades.
After the Dayton Accords ended the Bosnian War in 1995, the bunker opened its doors again, this time to tourists.
This bunker will probably stay a museum in the future, and hopefully it will never be used in a military purpose.
On the shores of the South China Sea, at Taiwan's northern tip, is the bustling port city of Keelung.
There are these rows of tall concrete buildings and these highways that burst through the canopy of the hills that surround the city.
It's part of Taiwan's cutting edge. There's huge power plants, there's many factories.
It's a modern jungle metropolis.
But something here is out of place.
So in the midst of this sprawling, very modern city, you see all these kind of ancient ruins scattered about.
There are these thick tree roots that are wrapping themselves around these blocks of stone, and it's hard to tell if they're keeping them together or if they're breaking them apart.
There are doorways and tunnels in some of these structures that lead down below.
In this tropical climate, it feels like you're in the middle of an Indiana Jones movie.
These crumbling ruins were built to guard against ruthless invaders, voyaging here from half the world away.
There was a fearsome enemy at the gates, and defeat here would have meant complete destruction for the defenders.
The old colonial powers were used to having it their way, but it wouldn't be so easy this time around.
Shan Yangbo is a Jilung native. He works to understand the significance of these stone relics, all orientated towards his city's port.
从小其实基隆炮台非常的多，那小的时候家里都会带我们就是到这些古迹的地方，然后来看这些炮台。那大约直到6年前的时候，开始研究基隆的这些历史，然后开始去了解，就是基隆整个城市的发展，其实都是跟我们的军事要塞其实有相关。
These are the Jilung fortifications. The earliest dates back to the 17th century, when predatory fleets roamed these waters.
The city of Jilung was founded by Spanish colonists in 1626.
So Jilung is a crucial point in the trade route between Japan and Korea in the north, and Hong Kong and Vietnam in the south.
The Spanish built these fortifications in order to control the local population, but also to protect themselves against attacks from foreign powers.
那它可以很明显的看到呢，这边的炮台它的结构都是用石头去砌成的，所以这边全部都是石砖做的石砖墙。现在看到的话是它的上面已经它的这些屋顶这些都已经没有了，都只有留下就是这些墙面。
But soon a threat to this domination loomed on the horizon.
Local populations at the time were really ill-equipped to defend themselves against these militaristic, better-armed colonizers. And ironically, the greatest threat to colonial rule was other colonists.
You see this kind of merry-go-round of colonial rule in Taiwan during this time period. First the Spanish, then the Dutch, then the British.
But by the 1800s, Jilung and the whole of Taiwan was firmly under the control of a Chinese empire.
The Qing dynasty was one of China's great powers and the last of its imperial dynasties.
The Qing Empire further expanded defenses to include the Urshuan fort.
二沙湾炮台的方向呢，其实很明显就可以看到，前面这边就是我们基隆港的大门，所以我们的大炮呢就是朝着这个方向就是射出去。我们现在看到的这一个啊，是二沙湾炮台它里面的就是弹药库。
These fortifications were well needed. Although there was no European presence left in Taiwan, the shadow of colonialism was still felt close by.
The French had a foothold in what is now Vietnam, but like all colonial powers, they wanted more.
They even asked the Qing Empire to remove Chinese troops from various Vietnamese cities.
At this point, the French and the Chinese are not actually at war, but for the people who are fighting on the ground, the reality was very different.
In August 1884, the French sent a small force to attack an unsuspecting Jilung.
法国政府他们认为需要占领一个，就是对于大清帝国非常重要的一个地方，然后他们再去做谈判的时候，他们可以有比较多的筹码。
This changed the scope of the war. The French had put boots on the ground on what was officially Qing territory.
Although the attackers were quickly repelled, it was not a wasted enterprise.
法军他们当时其实就已经认定，就是基隆港的防御太弱了，所以他们如果攻打的话，是很容易攻打下来。
The Qing were left with no doubts about the military superiority of their attackers. They appointed a man named Liao Ming Chuan to bolster their defenses.
Li Ming Chuan was the commander of the Taiwanese defensive troops against the French.
He sets upon this hurried mission to try and fortify Jilung against the French attack that he knows is coming soon.
He went on this massive building campaign that included the Shiqiuling fortification. He also recruited native Taiwanese fighters who were eager to defend their homeland from French foreign invaders.
Before his preparations were complete, the French returned.
On the morning of October 1st, 1884, the residents of Jilong were awoken by a cacophony of noise. There were French gunboats shelling their city, and residents could see landing craft on the coast with French mariners ready for battle.
The defenders were defeated comprehensively, but the bulk of General Liu's forces were dug in strategically around the city.
有民传他当时他相信基隆这边，因为我们有地形的优势，我们这边就三面是山，一面是海，敌人要从山下攻上来，其实没有那么容易。
They were essentially now caught inside the fortifications they thought would protect them.
Pinned down inside the city, the French troops began to rot.
For weeks, the French are trying to break out of the city. Li is able to resupply his troops with Chinese troops and other Taiwanese people from the island, while the French are gradually whittling down, not just because they're fighting, but because they're being hit by cholera and typhoid as well.
法国是没有的。所以他们来到之后，几乎有写过的文献里面都有提到，就是下雨这件事情。其实每一天至少都会有4个人因为下雨，然后后来得到霍乱，然后死掉。那他们当时其实都有记录，就是基隆的雨是所谓平行的雨，因为我们基隆冬天的时候东北季风的关系，这种雨在法国是没有的。
Eventually, French reinforcements arrived.
In March of 1885, the French finally break out of the fortifications of Jilong.
But with his superior numbers, Liao Mingchuan continued to fight a successful rearguard action.
Every step the French took inland was going to cost them dearly.
In April 1885, without making any significant gains against the Qing defenders, the French signed a peace treaty and left Taiwan.
实际上，真的打赢的时候呢，就是这边的当时的民众其实都是非常开心的。那其实另外比较特别的是啊，虽然法军他们离开了，其实法军离开他们也非常的开心，法军都是欢呼，坐着船离开。为什么？是因为他们认为是他们终于离开这个就是环境非常不好的一个战场。
Following the war, Liao Mingchuan became governor of Taiwan, leading a successful infrastructure building program and turning the country into an industrial powerhouse. To this day, he's still known as the country's father of modernization.
Today, Taiwan's status as an independent nation is the subject of intense debate between Taiwanese nationalists and mainland China.
And Yanbo believes that lessons learned during the Sino-French War can help his country in the present day.
其实我觉得一开始如果法军在刺探基隆海港的防务的时候，如果当时基隆的海港的防御量够强的话，其实法军不见得他们会攻打基隆港。所以其实从历史来看呢，其实基隆港它当时发生的问题，如果反映到我们现在国家的状况的话，其实都是同样，我们是需要有自己的就是适当的军队去防御我们的这个土地。
In northern Portugal, a quiet mountain lake sits in the arid Braga region.
It's a rugged terrain along Portugal's northern border with Spain. The Jerez mountain range rises up out of this parched landscape, and then out of nowhere, there's this vast body of water.
But during the driest months, when the water level recedes, a sunken mystery emerges.
A kind of modern-day Atlantis is emerging from the mud.
It looks like the skeleton of a village, like everything's been stripped away apart from the stone.
How does a whole village flood in the middle of an arid mountain valley?
And what happened to the residents?
Manuel Antunes can recall when there was life in this village some 50 years ago.
Estava a ver se encontrava aqui a casa da minha avó, do lado materno. Ficava por aqui algures. Vamos ver se encontramos. Aqui assim ficava a minha casa, a casa dos meus pais. Neste momento só se vê um bocadinho. Enfim, o resto de... No entanto, de vez em quando, tal como a fênix, vem ao de cima. Ou melhor, a água vai ao de baixo e a aldeia aparece. E aqui estamos novamente para recordar aquilo que foi Vilarinho da Furna.
It's said the village, once known as Vilarinho da Furna, can be traced all the way back to the 1st century, when it was settled by the Visigoths.
The story goes, during the Visigoth period, 7 families built settlements on the banks of the river.
We can see the traditions and practices of those Visigoth people, or early Germanic people, carried through all the way to the last days of this village.
E no local onde a gente se reunia, a fazer a tal junta, que era uma assembleia semanal. Normalmente era às quintas-feiras que se fazia isso. O representante de cada família juntava-se assim nos largos, tinham 2 largos, onde se juntavam para discutir os problemas da população.
This is a very communal form of living, and the town is ruled by a council made up of citizens called a junta.
But the fact that it was still pervasive at this time in the 20th century just shows how insulated this area is.
E votavam. Isso, uma questão qualquer que havia em discussão, e há votos, e se no fim, se havia empate, o juiz decidia. E esse juiz mudava todos os 6 meses. Mudava no dia 1 de janeiro e mudava no dia 1 de julho. Tal qual como se faz hoje na União Europeia. Eu acho que a União Europeia copiou o exemplo de Vilarinho da Furna.
But the village's traditional way of life would soon come head-to-head with a new modernizing regime.
In 1933, Portugal came under the control of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, the prime minister and founder of the Novo Estado, or New State.
Salazar inherited vast public debt, a crashing economy, and a rampant poverty across Portugal. Portugal was one of the most successful colonizing powers in Europe, but this time it turned its attention inwards.
He embarks on this program, what he calls internal colonization. He's going to revive all the overseas colonies, but he's also going to treat these barren parts of Portugal as colonies that need development.
Portugal's authoritarian government set out to transform not just the economy, but the very fabric of the countryside.
So in the case of these, hard-scrabble rural communities like Vilarinho da Furna, he's going to create these new hydroelectric projects to improve irrigation, to improve yields.
If you look at the head of the lake, this community's eventual downfall is sitting in clear sight.
In the 1950s, test drilling began in the Omem River Valley, downstream from the village.
Nós pensámos que não era possível, naquela altura, parar a construção da barragem. Porque nós estávamos num regime ditatorial, tipo fascismo, não era para brincadeiras.
The only option available to them is to sell, and the hydroelectric company, they set the price.
Their final offer? Half an escudo per 10 square feet of land. At the time, it was enough to buy a can of sardines.
The compensation paid to the entire village of Vilarinho da Furna was a little over $100,000 or 100,000 euros. That's what the whole village got.
The villagers even had to build the road that they needed to take to leave their village for the last time.
Do Rio para lá foram as próprias pessoas de Vilarinho que se tiveram que organizar para completar o estradão que possibilitasse a chegada de caminhões e até automóveis ligeiros.
No new village was built for them, and the approximately 250 people who lived there were on their own to resettle in cities or other towns.
You saw scenes of people lugging just planks and roof tiles and anything they thought they might be able to put to use in wherever they settled afterward.
For Manuel Antunes, the race was on to preserve any memory he could of his hometown.
Consegui 3 objetos que me ajudaram a salvar Vilarinho da Furna. Foi uma máquina fotográfica, foi um gravador para gravar as histórias, gravar as canções e depois também uma máquina de escrever, que era para escrever alguns artigos, para chatear o governo, para conseguir subsídios para fazer o Museu de Vilarinho da Furna. Curiosamente, eu fui a última pessoa a sair de Vilarinho e já tinha sido há muitos anos. De maneira que foi uma experiência, por um lado, traumatizante, mas por outro lado também satisfatória. Saber que estava a fazer alguma coisinha para salvaguardar a memória de Vilarinho da Furna.
In 1972, the dam was completed and submerged 850 acres of the valley underwater, including the now deserted village.
And nowadays, as you know, the water level rises and falls with the season. Every year, like clockwork, the village appears and then disappears.
The efforts of Manuel Antunes have preserved the memory of Vilarinho da Furna to this day in a nearby museum.
So you can go there and you can see artifacts of it, of what little was scavenged from the place before it was flooded.
Manuel even saw a chance years later to retrieve parts of the village inundated by the reservoir.
Mas houve em 1980, 81, houve um problema técnico ali na barragem, então esvaziaram totalmente a barragem. Então a aldeia ficou descoberta e aproveitou-se essa situação para vir buscar aqui alguma pedra para completar aquela que faltava no museu, porque nós levámos 2 casas para o museu. E hoje, acho que Vilarinho da Furna é hoje a aldeia no mundo inteiro mais conhecida. Eu tenho isso, dá uma certa satisfação, como é evidente, não é?